Perfect. This is working.
Wonderful. So thank you very much, Konstantin. My name is Mark MELNYKOWYCZ. I'm working at a startup in Switzerland where we are enabling the Internet of Humans. But first, before jumping into that, when we talk about technology and the way that humans and societies have been evolving, I like to think back on antiquity and mythology and the way that we were creating the deities and gods as a way to also communicate about our emotions, because it was actually a way for us to have a common way to discuss the way we were feeling, either individually or as part of a society. And the way that these stories have then perpetrated into stories that we might hear as children, or as what we retell in different societies as people have migrated, as the way that ideas have changed over time. I always like to think back to the way that we have historically tried to conceptualize who we are as a people. Because every year we start to add more and more layers of technology in a way to try and understand ourselves better. And I keep on wondering if we're getting closer to that through the more integration of technology, or getting farther away, which is oftentimes what we think about when people say that they're online all the time. They might say that they're more connected than ever before, but also more lonely. And so when I think about augmented reality, cross reality, or extended reality, and artificial intelligence, the question is always, is artificial intelligence really helping us understand ourselves or the people around us in our lives, or is it separating us? And another thing I often think about when it comes to these aspects of technology and society is what it means to be a human. In a way, artificial intelligence is built as a way to mimic human intelligence, to take what we believe is the best of ourselves and put it into a machine so that we can interact with machines in a more similar way that we interact with one another on a human-to-human basis. And when we start to talk about cyborgs, or we start to talk about Neuralink being put into our brain, there's a tendency to feel that we're getting away from being human. But this is also something we've been modifying over centuries, continually, sometimes without question. And I always wonder, when the first eyeglasses were starting to be introduced into society, were people thinking that this would be a strange technology that makes us less human because we no longer have to suffer through this degradation of sight as we did before? Or if these people were now considered to be superhuman because they could live for a long time, and they could still retain these abilities that only younger people would have had. And many times I run into people who have eyeglasses in the world, and I think, what a different world it would be if we didn't have this simple technology. And each layer of technology that we add to ourselves through artificial intelligence, or through sensor integration, or through robotics or prosthetics, I think it's important to think about how this is adding to the human condition as opposed to taking away from it. Now, coming back to where we are currently in 2020 and going into the 2021 and 2022, aside from COVID, or maybe in spite of it, one of the big topics is the explosion of content, connectivity, and data streaming. If you look at any sort of metric related to content creation, related to gaming, related to movies, to music, we have this almost exponential expansion. This is driven by many factors. On the one hand, it's cheaper than ever to actually create content. So if someone wants to create their own movie, they can do so probably with a few $1,000s worth of equipment. If they want to create their own music, they can put it out there. If it gets on the right streaming service, they can also stream it to millions, maybe even billions of people throughout the world. And this is also starting to bring up some of the modern challenges that we're trying to solve with technology and artificial intelligence. As we go from having a more presence as our reality, where if we want to talk with someone, we can do it through text, we can do it through chat, we can call them up, we can live stream video. Right now, it's very common to even just live stream video the entire time through your mobile phone, which even a few years ago would have been almost impossible due to the cost of data. And that's the consequence of everyone, at least in Switzerland and many parts of the connected world, being able to just escape the reality that they're in without even having to put on glasses. I mean, it's very easy to just open up your phone and dive into a content stream on any number of social media channels. But that also leads to one of the problems that we have, which is attention. If you're always allowing yourself to be tied into the way that social apps are designed, which means you have a streaming interface, it invites you to be pulled into the streaming content, you have a fear of missing out. Every time you scroll down the screen, you think, what's coming next? What's coming next? Right? So, and sometimes you don't even stop to watch the one thing that you actually thought was going to be interesting. You're just going to go down further because there's a feeling that there's something else there. There's a value there. And in truth, what you're doing is you're paying for the service with your attention, which I think is probably pretty commonly known nowadays, especially in more technology-centric circles. So when I think about humans nowadays, aside from just having reading glasses, we have connected devices like mobile phones connected to smartwatches. These could be connected to our smart glasses. They could be connected to other sensors on our body. So we're creating a lot of data around how we move. We can do algorithms for human activity characterization or recognition. So we can recognize how we're walking, how we're sitting, how we're sleeping, how we're running, how we're riding a bike. And then if we get on a train, you can have another classifier to know that you're sitting but moving at a high speed. So obviously you're on some sort of public transportation or in an automobile. And with these explosion of services, there's a lot of competition. There's an explosion of creation. But at the same time, when we talk about the current digital product society, we basically talk about humans and their data profile being the product, which is then being used by other services to market new products to us. And I think, how are we characterized as humans? Well, largely we're characterized by our interactions in the virtual world. So when we start to think of an extended reality, the way that we interact with that extended reality is sometimes more impactful to our lives than the way that we interact with our physical reality or physical time and space. And from an algorithmic standpoint, from an artificial intelligence standpoint, this is basically allowing us to build products that are nothing more than content recommendation engines. If we need support on making a product decision, there's tons of reviews. We can see who did 5 stars or 3 stars, and we can use this technology as a way to direct our decisions in the future. Other companies can use this as a way to characterize us. If I watch something on YouTube, all of a sudden I get new recommendations. If you watch something on Netflix, you're essentially just plugging into the recommendation engine. And those recommendations have actually far-reaching consequences, because now, if Netflix sees that a certain type of content, a certain type of hero movie is going to be watched by millions and millions of people, that's going then to direct the way that they're funding new media projects. And even though there's a lot of topics around neuromarketing and using a lot of sensors to characterize how people are reacting to media, the truth is we've already characterized people quite well just by the way that they interact with streaming content. But this also means that we are only looking at a very narrow segment of the way that we live our lives, right? If you only look at the way that a person is interacting on a mobile phone or with a particular streaming service, it's very narrow-minded. It really doesn't encompass the whole spectrum of what it means to be a human. Now, on the other hand, we oftentimes try to go another level forward. So we can characterize ourselves through our activity, and then the next level is to try and characterize who we are inside. So characterizing our emotions. Now, this has been done quite well, I would say, over the past 5 or 10 years from a computer vision standpoint. And when I say it's been done quite well, I just mean that we've been able to create algorithms that rely on convolutional neural networks, where we essentially take in a large set of training features. In this case, could be hundreds or thousands of people smiling or frowning or being indifferent. We use our AI algorithms to extract features about those faces, and then we've classified those faces, either as happy or sad or angry. And then because of that, we say that we understand how to recognize emotions in people when a new person is presented to the camera. Now, this isn't, there are companies that have built a lot of products around this, such as Effectiva. They have APIs where you can automatically plug in if a person is being attentive to a certain situation or looking in a certain direction. But at the end of the day, this doesn't really reflect who you are inside. It's only reflecting how you're perceived in the world. So for example, I'm not a person who usually has a ton of spontaneous facial features. I have other work colleagues where if you say something to them during a conversation, you can clearly see how they're reacting to you. You can clearly see when they're happy and when they're sad. And a lot of times I'm a type of person who probably won't show as many facial features. So using that type of algorithm to try and characterize the two of us is going to give two wildly different perceptions of what our emotions are. Because for one person, you can probably easily characterize frustration or calm or happiness. And for another person, you're not going to characterize anything. And then if you build a product based on this, then it's actually not going to fulfill the emotional needs that the person has who you're trying to build for, the user, the human. And this is one thing where we want to, let's say, look for different solutions. And one of these solutions is going to go in the direction of understanding what's happening in our brain. Now, when I think about cross reality or extended reality, I have a bit of a background also in wearable computing and looking at how we interact with different devices. And what I was always struck by was how segmented we are. When we talk about the explosion of new mobile computing devices like the HoloLens or new technologies from Qualcomm for XR development, many times the overwhelming vast majority of people interacting with computers are still doing it through push buttons, are still doing it through keyboards and mice. And then at some point that started to shift as we had mobile computing coming up. And then all of a sudden we could do pinching and zooming and tapping and moving things around in a slightly more natural user interface pattern. But this also still means that when we're interacting with a computer, we have to make a very, let's say, distinct decision about what we want to do. So if I want to tap on something on the screen, I have to do it with my finger. If I want to tell a program that I want to move forward in a game environment, I have to do that by pushing a mouse or pushing another button. And also in a mobile space, if I'm streaming through content, I have to filter through that content. I have to decide for myself what feels right for me, what I need at this point in time, or I'm just going to get caught up into the content bubble and I'll basically let the algorithm tell me what I'm supposed to be watching, which is realistically what is happening with a lot of people. So despite the interesting points of XR interaction with the HoloLens and other VR devices where we've thought about this concept of always having tactile feedback for our devices. Every time I've used HoloLens, I've thought it's a cool, I would say, spatial visual experience. But the thing I love about a simple computer mouse is that you can put it down on a table and its position will never change until you push it, right? So Newton's law of interaction, for every action, there is a opposite or equal reaction. And every time I try to manipulate a 3D object in an XR space or a VR space using my fingers, there's an inherent inaccuracy of my body, simply by the fact that if I stand up and hold my hands like this for 30 minutes at a time, I'm going to get incredibly tired. And the other thing is that when we have more and more content or possibilities to interact with the world, we basically just hit a limit by what we can cognitively absorb. You know, if you walk down the street, you will you'll focus essentially on how you're walking. You'll have some peripheral vision, but you have like a cone of attention. And you're basically throwing away like the vast majority of the information in front of you. You're using just enough so that you can navigate a space. But that also means you don't have attention left over to do other cognitive tasks. And so I'm always interested in how we can have other interaction devices which are allowing us to be characterized as humans, but then also use that characterization to interact with different things in our life. Now, I think this this picture from Qualcomm gave a pretty nice overview of where we are right now, more or less, with regards to sensor integration that can quantify humans in XR devices. So if you look at Magic Leap, we're still going towards the concept of a smart glass form factor for extended reality. And the main things that I think about when I think about XR are the spatial relationship that we have to our physical world. So having XR glasses that are able to see that I have a computer screen in front of me, that can see that there's a flat space in front of me. You know, we're able to use machine vision, I think, reasonably well to quantify the world around us. And we're able to use motion sensors like inertial monitoring units to quantify how people are moving, if you're running or you're walking. We can start to give feedback to people using haptic sensors. And we can use also light sensors to understand if a room is becoming too bright or it's too dark for a person. But one thing that we're still continually missing is understanding really what's happening inside of a person. We can do it to a certain extent using things like PPG sensors or heart rate monitoring sensors. They can also be integrated around the temple or inside the ear. But the question is how we can create this larger web of interaction. So one of the big things we work on, and one of the coolest things that I think is coming in technology, is the decreased cost of operating, building, and releasing neurotechnology products. So we work a lot with electroencephalogram, EEG, where we essentially attach electrode to the surface of the body, and we try and measure the basic electrical differences that are happening in the brain. So to create an EEG sensor, it's relatively straightforward. We have our brain, we then have our cranium, our skull, we then have skin. In this case, some people have a lot of hair, some people don't. And then we have an interface. So we'll take a conductive electrode, we'll put it on the top of the head. And what happens inside your brain is that you have your neurons, which are firing at different points in time. And with EEG, what we're trying to do is look at how different regions of the brain are being excited. So we're not really at the point where we can understand how like a single neuron is being excited or being firing, but we can understand how the general regions of the brain, you know, how one hemisphere versus another hemisphere is interacting or being excited by things that are happening in the environment or things that are happening inside the body. Now, the gold standard for measuring EEG has traditionally been gold cup electrodes. And in this case, we need to place an electrode on the top of the head. We use a conductive gel to increase the conductivity between the electrode and the body. And this way, we're able to get actually reasonably decent signals. The value of EEG compared to other brain imaging techniques is mainly that we have a continuous feedback of the time-based signals from the brain. So it's one of the systems which has, you know, really near instantaneous recognition of what's happening in our brain. If we're doing things like a MRI, for example, or a functional MRI, it's more of a state as opposed to having a very, you know, highly repeatable measurement. And there's been some explosion of electrode technology over the past couple of years, which is allowing us to move from laboratory scale EEG, where we might just do characterizations for how people are reacting to different media, trying to elicit different emotions, but always doing it within a laboratory. Neurofeedback came out with their essentially EEG VR platform a couple of years ago. I think they've more or less transitioned now more towards a data model and trying to create an everyday BCI device as opposed to having a large VR device. And a lot of this is driven by material science. So instead of having metal gold cup electrodes, what a lot of companies are doing is creating conductive polymers, which might be based on different conductive particles put together into an ink or to a mixed together into a conductive polymer. We then build different electrode configurations, which can go through the hair or can go on different parts of the body. And this way, we start to open up the ability to measure biosignals in EEG, not only within a certain specific point in time in a laboratory, but over a continuous day. Now, when we start to talk about algorithms and interpretation of EEG signals, EEG is a time-based signal. So that means we have a frequency and an amplitude of the signal that we're trying to measure. And we can use different algorithms to then extract information from this. We can use recurrent neural networks. So look at a time-based domain and try and see how the specific pattern and waveform is changing over time. And if we flag this and connect it to something which is happening in the user's environment, for example, listening to a particular type of music, or being in a very stressful occupational situation, such as surgery or some other very highly focused task, then we can start to see changes in how people are focusing and how their attention is being essentially impacted by their environment and what they're doing in life. And then on the other stage, if we have like very slow waves, these are usually what occur when we're sleeping. So we can see how people are going from a state of shallow sleep to deep sleep. And if we start to think about how we can modify people's behavior and allow them to sleep in a more complete way, EEG is one of the ways to do it, because we can understand how how their brain is changing much better than using a smartphone sensor or an accelerometer, which is mainly just measuring if a person is moving or not during the night. And from an algorithmic standpoint, we then will generally extract features such as amplitude and the change in amplitude based on frequency. So we're going from a time-based domain to the frequency domain. And for this, we can start to train algorithms for essentially whatever we want as far as the emotional and the environmental impact of the person in their society. Now, one of the great things that is coming out was the decrease in size, the decrease in batteries power. So when we're starting to design EEG BCI devices, brain-computer interface devices, it's getting much more cheaper and it's a lot easier to create these. This is a small spectrum that you can currently buy. On the left-hand side of the screen, we see things from BitBrain, which has a larger number of electrodes that goes over the head, so we can better localize signals in the brain. But many devices are focused on attention or calm and trying to get a general feeling for what's happening in your brain. So the Muse, for example, been used quite a bit in meditation. The Notion, the Neurosity device, is used by programmers to help them stay within a focused work flow for a longer period of time. And they'll start using music to essentially modulate your real world experience. And also G-Tech, Austrian company, has been coming out with the Unicorn device, which is also very, very good resolution, very good amplifiers, but is a very small device that can essentially fit on the side of the head. So we're now moving very directly into mobile computing with EEG. And when we start to fuse these with XR technologies, I think we're going to start to really open up a new paradigm in the way that we're interacting with computers. And the difference between what's happening now versus what had been happening, I would say 10 or 20 years ago, is really the improvement in electrode materials, the decrease in power requirements, improved connectivity, but also from an AI standpoint, the ability to deploy algorithms onto the hardware is really opening up a situation where these devices can be real companions to people, as opposed to only being devices which are created to send stuff into the cloud. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about how to essentially go further and make this an even easier use case. So one of the most pervasive devices that we have in the world is what we call the hearable, which is of course just a speaker that goes in your ear. The earbud form factor started about 2001, started coming out with mobile devices, and we've been slowly adding more and more functionality to the point where now we have noise canceling headphones where you can essentially just remove yourself acoustically from your environment. And this is really important because when we're designing XR experiences, sound is essentially half of the experience. The visual part is very important. It's very important to be able to stream 3D models into your environment and place them in the environment. But sound is a thing, and 3D sound is something which adds a certain tactile feeling to the experience. And if you don't have sound, we know that you can fall out of experiences relatively quickly. But if you want to suspend your disbelief and really immerse into products, the hearable is really one of the most powerful ways, the most powerful form factor to do this. And we're going to the stage now where we're integrating biometric data monitoring capabilities into our headphones. So whereas we went from getting the 3D audio right, or getting the streaming of audio correct from a technological standpoint, then essentially isolating users by using noise canceling, we can now go a step further. And now we can start to understand the user through EEG and through our brainwave signals in a more intuitive and, I would say, more simplistic way. So what we've been working on at IDUN is getting together a small product family of dry electrodes. So the dry electrodes are essentially just conductive materials that we can put on the body and get a high signal similar to the type of signal that we would get from a wet electrode. So we're developing 3 different product types. One is a small smart patch, which is currently used to collect EEG or ECG measurements. We're developing an electrode which goes through the hair, but which is also very comfortable. And then developing electrodes for the ear. And although this is quite interesting, the just developing the electrodes is sort of limiting because it only gives us like one part of the puzzle. If you only develop an electrode, then you're essentially a component supplier. But if we really want to understand how we can create new experiences for people in the world, we also have to take the electrode, connect it up with data interpretation, and then also device connectivity and the API. And this is what starts to form the web, or what we call the Internet of Humans. So much like we have the devices which can talk to one another all throughout the world, we want to allow devices to essentially understand your emotional needs. And this is like one of the things that underpins how we can better create a world which is more seamless between humans and technology. Now, these different electrodes, they have different, I would say, advantages and form factors. So when you look at most of the BCI devices, they're essentially looking directly at the forehead. And there's a good reason for this. This is the easiest way to put an electrode onto the head and have good compliance and have good connectivity between the electrode and the human body. The next thing is to have an electrode which goes through the hair. So there are different comb style electrodes like you see here, like we produce, but many of them are based around very hard materials. And the reason for this is that they're generally injection molded plastic together with a conductive coating like a chloride silver or silver chloride ink. And the problem here is that these are then relatively hard and not very comfortable. So if you really want to have a device which is being used over the entire day, it's a problem because people are naturally not going to want to wear it the entire time. Another point is that when you have electrodes on the head and you have a lot of motion, for example, if you're running, then you're going to have a mass on the head from the BCI, which is naturally going to move. And any type of movement is really going to disrupt the interface between the electrode and the body. And when that happens, you get a large spike in noise and the signal is going to be unusable until the device is settled again. So that's one reason why we thought that it made the most sense to take the knowledge that we had in electrodes from going on the body and going on the head and then putting it into the ear. the ear has a ton of advantages. And I mean, the reason that earbuds are so pervasive and so interesting nowadays is that it's a very small device. It sits inside your, it's actually almost kind of close to an implant. I mean, some of these devices really go far inside your ear. And I remember when the Apple earbuds were coming out, it was described as one of the first implants from Apple, as opposed to one of the new speaker products. And the reason they said that is that they were trying to pair Siri, and the artificial intelligence of Siri together with their electrode designs. And that's the main reason why we're looking at the ear, because it's very good as far as motion artifact reduction, because it's much closer to your center of gravity, and it's much closer to the center of gravity of your head. If you think about your body as a collection of rigid bodies moving together. And it's also sort of well protected. So if you have a lot of interface elements coming from things in your environment, there's noisy electronics all over the world. Sort of being inside the ear is also going to allow us to be, I think, a bit more isolated from the outside world and interference issues. So what we're bringing together is trying to have the entire value chain for people. So the idea is that if we connect material science with hardware design, data processing, this allows product integration. When you have product integration, the question is, what are we actually giving to new product experiences? And the thing that's really missing is emotional intelligence. When two people meet each other, you meet, even when we see each other over Zoom, we're automatically looking, we're extracting a lot of information. We might imagine that some people are attentive. We might imagine that some people are getting bored with the talk. And this feedback is really important because it's part of the things that really separates us from machines nowadays. You can create an algorithm for a machine which is trying to understand if you're happy or sad, but it's not something which it can be trained on you personally. We're generally using like very universal biomarkers to try and characterize people. And by creating an everyday BCI device, you open up more of the opportunity to allow machines to really understand you throughout the day and really understand your unique experience as being a person. So a bit of the vision that we have is people walking together with their smart earbuds, being connected to their mobile device and having their mobile device understand their needs. And at this point, when we start to talk about this issue of content streaming, we start to talk about this issue of overloading of data and experiences on the web or on the internet. The idea is that this can now be a marker for those devices to understand how to interact with you in a better way. Because streaming in and of itself, I mean, at some point, we're also going to hit a block. We're going to hit roadblocks where, similar to the way that the internet was built around a lot of mobile ads and internet ads in the early part of the expansion of monetization in the web. And then at some point, you would just look at a web page and you would start to visually block out different parts of a web page because your brain knew that this was useless. This was just an ad. So you would try to block that out and go directly to the content. And it's been sort of like a give and take, like a little cat and mouse game between UX designers and ad buyers or sellers and users to try and get a happy medium between a website which actually creates money for the people creating content, but which isn't horribly annoying for people who are trying to look at that website. And part of the reason for that is that we don't know what we need. We don't know if we're feeling overpowered or frustrated inside a user experience. So part of what we do, aside from electrodes, is then starting to look at the impact that our brain waves have, together with the impact of external environments. So this is a little snapshot of one of our development platforms where we take in the brainwaves from a user. We can then design our API based on raw data, and then start to connect it with different experiences. And from some of our background, the idea of connecting to visual animations and artistic animations is a really interesting prospect because it allows people to understand how their brain state is changing over time. along with this increase in content creation is also a need for things like mindfulness and meditation. And this is starting to, I think, become more pervasive as a reaction to the increased content streams that we're exposed to every day. So part of the things that we're looking at is how can we represent brain data for people in intuitive ways so that they understand more how they feel themselves. And then they can use this as a visual marker for understanding how different things in their environment are affecting them. And that comes into actually a bit of research with regards to flow state and emotion. Emotion is one of the things which is incredibly important to the human experience, but more kind of impossible to measure. Many people can feel when they're frustrated, they can feel when they're happy, they can feel when they're sad. But it's very difficult for anyone who is not you to understand what you're feeling. And another thing is the way that we react to different stimuli. So the idea of music being like a universal language that everyone enjoys is true to a certain extent, but we have many different types of music because we have many different types of likes and dislikes in society. I mean, just the way that different cultures grow up based around different types of music really impacts how our brain develops and how we communicate within these different cultures. And that also makes sense for why, if I'm listening to Master of Puppets, or if I'm listening to very slow brainwave type music, my brain is going to be reacting in different ways. And what we're looking for is a way to do a spectrum for understanding when a person is very bored or very frustrated. So when they're falling out of this flow state. There's a lot of different neurotechnology companies working on this right now, but the idea is that if we can understand this basic change in focus and frustration over time, we can then just start to modulate different experiences. And by doing that, we then lead to a better overall product for people. So a classic example here is in game design. The tower defense I chose because tower defense is a very old game paradigm. If you look at game mechanics, they have changed, or how they've evolved over time and how they're changing with XR. We just heard a lot about augmented reality games in the environment and how you can have different interactions with people who are in the real world environment, and how it can be sometimes a problem because when you're playing a game, you're in a very specific use case. You're generally by yourself, even if you're playing online, or if you're playing in a collaborative world or an open world, and you have to respect game mechanics of that world. And one really interesting thing with the flow state characterization is that we can then have the ability to understand when a person is frustrated or being bored. So generally speaking, if a game is too easy, then people probably aren't going to play it. They might start playing the first few levels, but if it gets too difficult, then they also might drop out of it because they can't engage with it at the level that they need to engage with it. And we have some ways of modulating the way that games are presented for a user. So if you're playing Doom, for example, you have multiple levels of difficulty, and that's now become quite standard in a lot of games to adapt to different players' needs or wants. But something even cooler is if the game can just do that on its own. I mean, if the game can challenge me in an interesting way, which I wasn't expecting, it then becomes more not just an open world, but really an open experience, which is really unique to me. And that type of uniqueness, I think, is something that we can bring to different products. And by doing that, we can then open up this XR environment. And the key to opening up the emotional feedback within XR and other environments is this circular process of sensor processing, applying the right AI algorithms to extract features from our brain state, and then using algorithms to predict what users' needs are based on their specific product experiences. So, a key example of this is if we're dealing with Netflix, for example, or different streaming services, we'll have the ability to essentially understand when different contents are making you feel frustrated or sad or happy. And this is a way that we can then optimize how our products can give you what you need as a person, as opposed to trying to confuse or frustrate you. And beyond those experiences, we've been looking at a few different use cases. So on a very high level, there's topics based around education or psychological journey tracking. So trying to understand the mental state of a person and how their changes in their user behavior can then lead to changes and improvements in their lives. But one of the most pervasive things is music and media, gaming, and also the smart home. So we're really looking at ways where we can help to change the environment of a person or a user and allow it to really react to them in a positive and meaningful way. And part of this is then opening up the ability to fuse these different data types together. So before I talked about human activity recognition, and it's quite easy to apply an AI algorithm to just look at the frequency change and how a person is walking or running. And now you've identified what state they're in physically. And now if you can identify what state they are in mentally, you then have this ability to really see how we can change their product environment. So it's a combination of human state together with human needs, which allows us to build this platform for allowing interaction between the physical and virtual worlds in a more emotional and, I would say, fulfilling way. And one example of this is in augmented gaming. So when we apply our electrodes to the head of a player, we're starting to look at different ways that we can modify interactive experiences. So if you ever played Horizon Zero Dawn, it's a very, I would say, interesting fantasy immersive environment with a lot going on inside the game world. Visually, it's very visually appealing and very interesting from that perspective. But of course, you're normally interacting with it with a conventional player. So if you're using, one button to go forward, one button to pick what you want to do inside the world or to interact with players. And what we were doing in this activity was to connect the increase in alpha activity of the player's brain to the way that they're aiming their weapons. So in this case, it was a very straightforward proof of concept to show that when you're inside the game world, you can essentially increase the alpha state of your brain. And this then interacts with the aiming system of the game. And it was the first proof of concept just to show that we could start to bridge the worlds between traditional game interaction and brain state characterization. And right now we're looking at how to expand upon this and then also looking for different game experiences to start modulating. So it'd be really interesting, for example, to modulate the difficulty of different interpersonal games. If you're looking at, for example, doing a surgery through VR or looking at ways to do training through XR, we might look at ways how when your brain state is becoming more confused, that you have to take a step back and calm yourself before going forward. So there's a lot of topics with regards to brain training and resiliency that we can start to access now that this technology is there. So another quick example of what we've been working on is connecting the forward brain state, also with alpha activity, to connected animations. So with regards to this total feedback loop, this total neurofeedback value stack, we could call it, here we're connected up with Touch Designer. So on the small laptop screen, you see the raw data being streamed from my colleague's head. And then we was coding essentially a large cherry blossom animation. And we want to use this as a way to show how we can now start creating environments that are either projection mapped around a person or just projected within an XR or a VR device. And if we don't want to go into a meditative state, or if we want to start becoming more mindful, we can use these types of interactions with neurofeedback to help train people to regulate their emotions and to, more holistically take control over what's happening in their mind. So an example here is that when we had low alpha activity, the cherry blossom is essentially very sparse. And then as you start to focus or as you start to close your eyes, our algorithm is then extracting the alpha activity, so I would say the medium brain state between approximately 7.5 to 12 hertz. And then we start to see an increase, and we start to allow the cherry blossom to blossom. And in this way, it was one of our first interactive art projects, which now that we sort of create the foundation for this, we can start to expand it. And having a device which is wireless, understanding the person's body, and then connecting with an interactive experience is really going to be one of the most, I think, powerful things that's going to come to XR, maybe over the next 3 to 5 years. Another topic is also meditation, and essentially how we immerse ourselves more quickly within meditative environments where we can calm ourselves. So again, thinking about when you're in a work environment, it might be very hectic. The ability to take a break and to control your emotions in the way that you want, as opposed to being overpowered by the world, is something that's really interesting to bring to people. So in this case, we're using our electrodes, which are directly inside the ear, as opposed to on the forehead. So the electrodes, instead of being these devices which have to be placed into a headband, they can now just be placed into a small earbud device, like we were showing before in our renders. And in this case, we are essentially doing the same thing, though. We're seeing the same type of brain activity. We're seeing the same change of state of the brain, and then connecting it up with how not only meditation is affecting the brain, but then also how music and meditation can work together to bring you into a deeper meditative state. And then I'd like to talk briefly about the other product integrations that we're looking at. And one of the things that I wanted to also say is that we're really looking for different partners to work with. So especially one of the things I was really interested about the XR event today was to connect with other people who would also see the value in using neurofeedback within their experiences. And then seeing if we have collaborations for building new products. The smart home has always been, I would say, one of the most straightforward products that we can imagine. The reason for this is that with the decrease in, again, battery size, improved connectivity, but also general cloud computing in general, the ability to have connected devices throughout our home, which is, essentially helping us to live a better life, is really becoming pervasive in some parts of the world. If we want to, for example, change the heating in our home, change the lighting, change anything that's connected to us, it's a way that we can now do it without having to clearly tell a computer, I feel stressful right now, please change the color of the lights. And for example, when we connect up through wireless protocols from a BCI to a home device, this essentially makes it very seamless and possible to do. So now the device really sees you more as a person, as opposed to just a data point which is walked into the home. And the good thing about the current state of IoT in the world is that we already have the framework for it. We already have things like MQTT brokers, devices like the Philips Hue bridge, where we just need to stream the data to it, and we can already create these immersive experiences. And this is also a bit of a snapshot of how the API works, just from an algorithmic standpoint. So by taking the raw data, we extract features, and then we're essentially putting this into our API, which is then sending a message through MQTT or another protocol through the phone, or directly through a broker to a connected home device. And the same concept can then be used with meditation or any of these, I would say, relatively straightforward neurofeedback user experiences. So I'd be happy to have a discussion or answer any questions about this. We're based in Switzerland. We focus a lot on the technology development, but we're also really focused on sharing different ideas about neurotech in society. So we have a chapter from Neurotech X in Zurich, and Neurotech X is also a very pervasive organization now. It started in Canada, but now it's coming out to different parts of the world, including in Europe. The San Francisco chapter has hack nights every week where you can go there, talk about what's happening in neurotechnology. And there's such a huge crossover of artificial intelligence because the characterization of brain states through the explosion of algorithms and different algorithmic architectures is really making it possible to understand what's happening in our brain using EEG or MRI or any other of the brain computing technologies and imaging devices, and then connecting it up with these products. So we're essentially engineers, we're hackers and product developers, and looking forward to bringing EEG into the internet of humans and connecting up with different product experiences. So I'd be very happy to take questions and have any feedback. Thank you.